Hello, my name is Garrick Heilman, and welcome to our lecture titled The Wildest Macro Dream, the Geopolitics of Cryptocurrency. It's a very exciting time here on the 3rd of April, 2025, the day after the Trump administration announced massive global tariffs, to be talking about macroeconomics and geopolitics. And we're going to get into questions such as, is cryptocurrency geopolitical? Can Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency ever become money? And we're going to try to peer a bit into our crystal ball, look into the future, and think about the ways this whole space could evolve given the different macro dynamics and geopolitical tensions that are emerging in the world of cryptocurrency. So without further ado, let's dive into our standard disclaimer. Macroeconomics is the area of my PhD, macroeconomics and history. And I just want to make very clear, we'll be drawing, of course, from that toolkit throughout this lecture, but there is no such thing as a ironclad law of macroeconomics. You get weird things happening in the macro world all the time, like today, where we see something that's not supposed to happen, both the US dollar and gold dropping together. We see all sorts of weird things happening all the time in macro, and that's partly why it's so exciting, but also partly why it is a set of tools and frameworks that do not resemble, to be crystal clear, anything like a law of physics. So just with that disclaimer out of the way, wanted to now move on to the next comment, which is just a quick word about the tariffs, because they are top of mind. It's an incredibly interesting macro situation we're in right now, and there's a lot more we could say about the tariffs and what impact they may have on cryptocurrency. The one thing I would like to do just briefly before we get into the meat of the presentation is say something about the size of the tariffs, which to me are really sized to trigger financial crises around the world. These are massive tariffs. And if these tariffs do persist into the future, I think one of the key questions that macro observers like myself will be focused on is the dynamic of Federal Reserve independence. Typically in a financial crisis, countries around the world will call up the New York Federal Reserve, request a dollar swap line, in other words, a way to borrow dollars to prop up their banks, say in Europe and elsewhere around the world. And traditionally, the New York Fed has answered that call and provided unlimited swap lines to the Bank of England, to the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, et cetera. I think a key question for many is, will that call be answered this time? It looks to me like these tariffs are sized to put financial crisis pressure on countries around the world. Whether we see it first in emerging markets or elsewhere is to be determined. But will the Fed play ball with the Trump administration and maybe limit access to dollar liquidity as a way to strengthen the Trump administration's bargaining position on tariffs? We shall see. If you want more on the topic of Fed independence, there's a lot, like I said, we could say on that topic, but I would point you toward this great book, The Secrets of the Temple by William Greider, written primarily about the late 1970s, early 1980s Federal Reserve. Still a wonderful book that gets into the mechanics of Fed independence and the dynamics between a Federal Reserve and a president that are not always aligned. Okay, so enough about the current macro tariff trade situation. Let's get into the core subject today. So first, let's start with the topic and the title of this lecture, The Geopolitics of Cryptocurrency. I think probably some of you are wondering, is cryptocurrency geopolitical? And it's a great question that I think we need to kind of hit on right off the bat. So for me, I always thought there was the potential from early on in my writings and research on cryptocurrency for this to become geopolitical. I would point towards a post on my blog from 2016 where I wondered about whether the People's Bank of China might consider embracing Bitcoin. And that turned out to, it appears, not be something the PBOC followed. They weren't, I guess, following my advice, perhaps wisely so. We shall see. But from early on in my discussions with my PhD supervisor, Neil Ferguson, who, of course, is writing the official biography of Henry Kissinger, one of the great geopolitical thinkers of the 20th century, and very active even up until his death just a short while ago, it was, I think, interesting to contemplate how this thing called Bitcoin and blockchain technology could rise in importance and actually become something geopolitical, play a role in this game of great powers that we see currently unfolding between the China and the United States. When we published the Cambridge benchmarking studies, one of the things we did in 2017 was try to map the global nature of cryptocurrency. This is a map of Bitcoin mining, and early on, key geopolitical players like China, like the United States, Russia, et cetera, were major Bitcoin miners. So there's always been a global nature to this. And as this asset class has gone from, thousands to millions to now trillions of dollars in value, it has become globally significant. It is something that nation states may be trying to leverage in their great Game of Thrones as they compete with each other for financial and economic and military power around the world. So, having said that, I think it's really important to understand this distinction between crypto as a crypto asset versus crypto as a cryptocurrency. And here, where I'm going with this is basically the narrative around Bitcoin today is largely that it's digital gold. Never mind the fact that Bitcoin's price is down roughly 20% this year in 2025, whereas gold is up 20%. They're moving in very different directions of late. It's not really behaving, one could argue, like digital gold or like a safe haven asset. But putting that point aside for a second, the key thing I want to emphasize here with regards to geopolitics is that, yes, perhaps Bitcoin or something else could play some geopolitical role as a crypto asset. However, I think it's much more interesting geopolitically as a cryptocurrency. In other words, if something, Bitcoin or something else, perhaps a stable coin, perhaps something that one of you will invent someday, becomes a true currency, and we'll briefly review what is currency, what is money here in just a moment. But if something becomes a means of exchange, a payment system, and is not just a store of value like digital gold is, then it, I think, has the potential to play a much greater role on the geopolitical stage. So, can a cryptocurrency become money? So we covered a bit of this already in this this course, but I just want to briefly review because it's so important, I think, to understanding the geopolitical nature of cryptocurrency, this question of what is money. Now, of course, it used to grow on trees. It was paper in countries like the UK before it became plastic. But the key thing I want to point out here is that still today, very, very few people actually know where money comes from. It is not coming from the government or central banks primarily. It's coming from private sector banks who are lending money into existence. That is not a widely known fact. It's something we have to continue to, I think, emphasize in our teachings and our lectures on what is cryptocurrency, because it really gets to the root of, I think, a lot of the misunderstandings around what is Bitcoin, what is cryptocurrency, what is money, what role could these things play on the geopolitical chessboard. So banks lend the vast majority of our money into existence. When you go get a mortgage, you get an auto loan, the bank creates new money. A very tiny percentage of our money is actually minted by central banks or federal governments around the world, oftentimes less than 10%. Most of our money is privately created. And oh, by the way, Bitcoin is a privately created instrument. So there is this resemblance between our financial system of today and the cryptocurrency world. There's huge differences, of course, in terms of the level of regulation around banks and lending multiples, reserve ratios, and so on. But a bank is a private sector for-profit enterprise. Cryptocurrencies have emerged out of the private sector as well. Okay. And of course, the point I always like to highlight here as well on this topic is that many, including Henry Ford, thought that this mystery of where money comes from is actually something that authorities don't necessarily want the general public to understand. It is perhaps well enough that the people of the nation do not know or understand our banking system and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there'd be a revolution before tomorrow morning, Ford famously said. But I'm on a mission to make sure more and more people understand where money comes from, how it's created, and the fact that it's not something that is fully controlled by central banks and governments. Is Bitcoin money? Many would argue, no, it doesn't really meet the definition of money. Still, it's a store of value primarily, or an investment. Yes, people buy things to a limited degree with money. And I've seen contracts priced in Bitcoin where it serves as a unit of account. But it's mostly investment today and a store of value. It's not money. So, and there's this question of whether it will ever become money. There's arguments put forward by cryptocurrency pioneers like Nick Szabo that it is inherently more volatile than, say, central bank currency. And that's because there's genuine uncertainty about whether or not what future role it's going to play. And that uncertainty creates volatility. And volatility is a big problem with regards to it serving as a currency. Remember, it can be an investment, it can be an asset. But for it to be a currency that's widely used, it would ideally be less volatile. The volatility has been a feature to date, I would argue, not a bug. It's attracted adoption, raised awareness of cryptocurrencies, a lot of media attention around the wild price swings of crypto. But it's hindering its effectiveness for pricing day-to-day transactions. So, while the volatility of cryptocurrency certainly has worked against it becoming more widely used as money, there's one thing that blockchain technology has undeniably achieved, which is a new kind of like measure and way of minimizing the degree of trust that parties have to have with one another to transact. And that's a very significant development. So on the one hand, you have this volatility maybe working against cryptocurrency serving as a medium exchange. But on the other hand, the trust minimization and decentralization that blockchain technology has brought into the world has really advanced, I'd say, the argument for could cryptocurrency become a monetary instrument. It has a quality like an element of the universe, gold, that is incredibly decentralized, backed up by the laws of physics. That helps kind of support gold's use as a monetary instrument, historically at least. Cryptocurrency has a limited need to trust in a institution or an authority. It is backed up by computing power, by thousands of nodes in a network that helps ensure its scarcity and that transactions won't be censored, and so on and so forth. So in this way, it has made a huge step towards becoming something that potentially could be conceivably used as money. And helping to advance us, as Muneeb Ali says from Blockstack, from a world of don't be evil to a world of can't be evil. Okay, so let's now look ahead into our crystal ball to try to think about how Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and blockchain technology can play a significant geopolitical role. And the first thing to start with is, I think, an understanding of how Bitcoin and blockchain technology do not exist in a vacuum. They're a part of this world. They're a part of the global economy now. And there's been some things that have been happening alongside the rise of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency that have provided a bit of a tailwind, one would argue. This is former Governor Mark Carney, current Prime Minister, Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, and current Prime Minister of Canada, a fan of festivals when he was in England. I think he's there sipping a beer and enjoying a burger at one of England's many great music festivals. But Carney had this to say about peer-to-peer economic activity. The economy is reorganizing into a series of distributed peer-to-peer connections across powerful networks, revolutionizing how people consume, work, and communicate. So Uber, Airbnb, all these things have been happening alongside the rise of cryptocurrency. The idea that you don't necessarily need a trusted intermediary to facilitate economic transactions. Peer-to-peer economic activity is kind of a macro mega trend, arguably, that's propelling all of this technology forward and is very supportive to the rising use of cryptocurrencies, perhaps even as a currency. So again, coming back to this point we raised earlier, really, really important to emphasize here in the geopolitical context about the different role that cryptocurrency could potentially play if it is just digital gold versus if it becomes something more like a new version of Visa and the US dollar. If Bitcoin, which combines elements of a payment system plus a currency together, right, a unified network, it's not just SWIFT, it's not just the dollar, it's an integrated system that brings both the currency unit and the payment network together. That has much greater geopolitical significance than it just being digital gold. So to think about the geopolitics of crypto, we need to interrogate this question of whether or not something like Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency could become something resembling, say, the US dollar and Visa, but as an integrated system. So here we're going to put on our economic history hat, and we're going to look at the history briefly of other alternative currencies. There's hundreds of years of history. One of my first papers was on this topic when I presented at the Bitcoin 2013 San Jose conference, which was really my first introduction to the Bitcoin community. I presented this paper about the history of alternative currencies, and it's a pretty grim history, to be perfectly candid. The vast majority of alternative currencies die a relatively quick death, both ones from a long time ago or from the Great Depression, when there was a huge rise in the number of alternative currencies, to even more recently introduced digital alternative currencies like beans and flues, which came out of the .com boom in San Francisco, California, where I'm based. And those also died relatively quick deaths. There were very interesting experiments that occurred during the Great Depression around currency, including this free geld currency that was introduced in Austria that had a demurrage kind of quality to it, meaning it lost value over time to try to incentivize people to spend it. One of the big problems in the 1930s, and one of the big criticisms of Bitcoin by many economists, is that people are incentivized to hoard currency when prices are going down. If prices are going down, you wait to the next day or the next month before you buy something, and that can cause the economy to seize up like an engine, kind of freezing and going into a tailspin. So currencies like the free geld here were introduced, but they were banned. This one was banned by the Austrian central bank. So regulators put this alternative currency out of existence. That does happen on occasion, but the vast majority of alternative currencies throughout history have simply died, not at the hands of regulators. And many people point to Augustin Carstens, the general manager of the Bank of International Settlements, who's been very anti-crypto. You young people should stop trying to create money, as he said. Regulators have not killed the vast majority of alternative currencies. It's actually been just simply a lack of demand that has killed cryptocurrencies. There are reasons regulators might ultimately decide to crack down more than they have on cryptocurrency. And certainly we see not just cyber criminals, but nation states, most notably North Korea and the Lazarus group, having great success hacking into cryptocurrency exchanges, into other platforms that hold cryptocurrency, being able to wash that cryptocurrency through vehicles like Tornado Cash or through other mechanisms and convert that currency into actual renminbi or dollars or something that can be used in the real world much more easily than Bitcoin or Tether can right now. That's a real concern. I mean, there's definitely some evidence that North Korea, for example, is financing some of its weapons of mass destruction program with cryptocurrency. That makes cryptocurrency geopolitical, of course. At the same time, very sophisticated tools have been developed, of course, by the chain analytics companies to track the flow of crypto. And this is something law enforcement loves. When I've worked with law enforcement in the past, we've used tools like this to find the money, find the crypto. And law enforcement's had huge success, basically reclaiming cryptocurrency from the bad guys. The whole reason the Trump administration is very easily able to create a Bitcoin reserve is because of the tens of thousands of Bitcoins that the U.S. government has successfully seized from bad actors and currently possesses to kind of seed that reserve. One can imagine these chain analytics tools also being quite useful to intelligence agencies and other, people looking at threat finance to not just track where the money is and maybe reclaim it, but perhaps even anticipate threats by the movement of funds on chain. Blockchains are public ledgers. And perhaps if cryptocurrency starts to become more widely used for actual purchases and transactions, you could see something like a Minority Report type scenario where there's a way to anticipate something based on the flow of funds through on-chain data. So that's kind of a counter argument to the notion that, because bad actors love crypto and use it, that somehow law enforcement is going to be opposed to its further growth and use. On the contrary, there are actually some real advantages from a law enforcement and policing the global world perspective from more and more crime or terrorism or hostile nation states using crypto. The volatility, we've talked about this. That's a big problem with the rise of crypto becoming more widely geopolitically significant. I don't think we need to say too much more about that. So will Bitcoin die? Should we just say rest in peace, Bitcoin? Are there other reasons for why we think cryptocurrency will never rise to geopolitical significance? Well, there are. Let's go through the bear case basically and talk about why maybe we've seen the high watermark here with Bitcoin's significance and the rise of crypto from a geopolitical perspective. Let's start with how complicated this is. Again, we're trying to answer this question of what could help or hurt the rise of any crypto, not just Bitcoin, although that's the leader by far and away in this kind of race to become a geopolitically significant currency. What could help or hurt its rise to becoming something more like money? Well, one thing that certainly undermines, I think, unquestionably Bitcoin's rise to becoming an actual currency is how complex it is. Many people do not understand how Bitcoin works. In polling that we've done, where we asked people about other advanced technologies such as like quantum computing or artificial intelligence, blockchain comes out number one as the least well understood advanced technology. And people tend to be a bit conservative when it comes to their finances. They want to understand where their money is, how their money works. Many people are old-fashioned, want to go down to the bank still and be able to talk to a real person about their accounts and getting financial advice and so on and so forth. So the complexity of Bitcoin is certainly something that undermines its use as a currency. There's all sorts of risks with storing it. And you could do everything right in adopting Bitcoin. You could buy it at the right time and store it in the right way. And then all of a sudden your girlfriend throws out your hard drive, like happened in the UK. And this poor bloke in the UK still 10 years on trying to get a council in Wales to allow him to excavate a dumpster dump facility to try to get his 8,000 Bitcoins on a hard drive, his private keys on a hard drive back, right? So there's a real risk to adoption from all the ways in which you can lose it, have it stolen, et cetera, et cetera. There's some irony around how advanced this technology is, which on the one hand is, trying to replace banks, arguably, and traditional currencies. And we still think the safest way to store private keys is often on paper in a bank safe deposit box. I know there's more advanced tech out there for some, but this is actually still a very common way in which many people are storing their high-tech digital currency using banks, using paper. There's a lot of competition, right? And even though Bitcoin is still the leader and has been for some time, it's not, just sitting there kind of in an undisputed number one position, right? There are many cryptocurrencies that, like Mimblewimble, which was interesting from both a scalability and a privacy perspective, offering advanced technologies, new features. Stablecoins are arguably the biggest threat of all to the rise of any one cryptocurrency emerging as the true dominant geopolitical crypto. Environmental concerns, these seem to have kind of passed a bit by the wayside with the rise of AI and the massive amount of energy demands for artificial intelligence. But historically, as the price of Bitcoin has gone up, the amount of energy that Bitcoin consumes goes up as well. And this does raise concerns in the media and amongst everyday folks who are concerned about climate change and rising temperatures. We've got very few merchants accepting Bitcoin still 16 years on after its existence. How is this going to achieve broad adoption as a medium of exchange if you can't solve this chicken and egg problem of merchants first accepting it and people also wanting to spend it? People tend to want to invest and hoard their Bitcoin. I think another key thing to think about with regards to the future of Bitcoin as a currency is there's a social movement behind this whole phenomenon. People were motivated by the 2008 financial crisis. Satoshi Nakamoto famously published the Bitcoin white paper a few weeks after Lehman Brothers failed on Halloween 2008. But social movements can fizzle, as we saw with Occupy Wall Street, which also came out of the financial crisis, right? They lost momentum. I know many people, Jameson Lopp, I think for one, very influential Bitcoin developer and entrepreneur, worries most of all in terms of threats and risks for Bitcoin about apathy and something like what happened with Occupy Wall Street happening to Bitcoin, where people stop caring about it. I think something that's not studied enough or discussed enough is ownership concentration. I've been tweeting about this recently. The more concentrated the ownership of a monetary instrument, the less useful it becomes. You need to have this thing that we're going to call money widely distributed, right? And as you see, the U.S. government holding a large position, Michael Saylor holding a large position, ETF managers like BlackRock increasing their position, and a few handful of people controlling more and more of this thing, it becomes less likely to become widely used as a currency, right? There's questions also about still the identity of Satoshi Nakamoto and who this person is. And that's something that I think people rightfully wonder about. Satoshi owns, we think, about 5% of the Bitcoin. That's a very significant share. What if we find this person? What if this person turns out to be a less than saintly figure like some of the other open source leaders like Vitalik and Linus, who are widely respected and beloved? The mystery of who Satoshi is, I think, has worked well for Bitcoin's rise as the leading cryptocurrency to potentially become geopolitically significant, but it's not guaranteed that Satoshi's identity will remain a mystery forever. There is the threat of quantum computing that's being widely discussed and debated on crypto Twitter and elsewhere right now, what to do. There could be some kind of schism over proposed soft and hard forks to protect Satoshi's coins from a future quantum attacker. Lots of debate about whether coins should be recycled, they should be basically burnt, et cetera, et cetera. But there's still also just this fundamental risk of a quantum attack, especially in the short run, causing massive direct disruption. There's a lot of quantum resistant cryptography that's being developed. I think just the key thing here to emphasize is that unlike gold, which is secured by the laws of physics, mathematics is what's securing Bitcoin. And if there is a break that cannot be easily remedied in the cryptography, then this whole thing is, gone, at least in the short run. I think many people are quite optimistic that there'll be more work and investment into quantum resistant cryptography than there is into quantum attacks, but we shall see. It's held together by mathematics, and if there is a problem with that math, then it's not going to be very valuable. But of the many things that could cause, I think, Bitcoin to fail or any cryptocurrency to rise to a geopolitically significant status, and remember, we're focusing on whether it can become a currency. I think it's this issue of people not getting paid their salaries in Bitcoin that is maybe the biggest barrier to it. So there's the chicken and egg problem we talked about earlier about businesses not accepting Bitcoin. Well, they probably want to see people getting paid in the currency that they're going to choose to accept. And that has not really happened in any significant way 16 years on from the invention of Bitcoin. So what can people do to solve that problem? Perhaps stablecoins can help facilitate a solution to this chicken and egg problem. We shall see. But that is, I think, arguably the single biggest barrier, natural barrier at least, to the rise of any cryptocurrency becoming widely used as a medium exchange is the lack of people receiving their paychecks in that cryptocurrency. Okay, so enough with the doom and gloom. We went through a number of the leading arguments people will make on why something like Bitcoin will not rise to become a true medium exchange. Let's talk about some of the more bullish sentiments. We can end on a happy note here, on a more positive note. Earlier we mentioned how many of the alternative currencies throughout history, the vast majority of them had failed relatively quick deaths, dying not at the hands of regulators, as many have always feared in the case of crypto, that the regulator would be what would put crypto out of business. Actually, most alternative currencies die from a lack of demand. There are, though, counterexamples that actually were quite successful over a long period of time. And I highlight in my paper the alternative currencies throughout history that were successful. One of the leading examples of this is merchant tokens in the UK. In fact, this one's from Lyceum Theatre, which is right next door to where I did my PhD at the London School of Economics, still around all these centuries later. But basically, in the 16th through 18th century, we saw the rise of these merchant tokens. So tokens created by the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker to kind of solve this problem of the lack of small change. There was a shortage of pennies and half pennies. And you can read about the big problem of small change if you're interested in it. But basically, small merchants created their own currencies to grease the wheels of commerce. And even when the king regulated these out of existence for a short period of time, they came back because they solved a fundamental economic problem, this lack of small change. So for several centuries, merchant tokens were quite successful. They lasted a long time. They solved a real economic problem. So not all alternative currencies die. Maybe digital gold is also the path towards becoming a more widely used currency. There's some who have kind of theorized a kind of adoption curve that looks something like this, where we are basically kind of going through the early phases where something has to achieve store of value status, digital gold status, reliable store of value before it can transition to becoming a more widely used medium of exchange, and that's the most important step in the process. Will we see another financial crisis soon? Perhaps with these tariffs. Hyman Minsky, who is a bit of the Vincent van Gogh of macroeconomics, never fully appreciated during his lifetime, unfortunately, came up with a wonderful theory of financial instability due to credit cycles and so on that really helped explain the 2008 financial crisis. Certainly, I think if we are entering a new financial crisis, people will continue to look for safe havens, alternatives, things that are disconnected from the existing financial world, and cryptocurrency certainly offers a potential option there, which again could help drive it to become more widely used, not just as a store of value, but as a currency. As we think about where we are kind of in macroeconomic history, I think it's also important to understand that we are at an inflection point with regards to the global financial system and monetary order. The great economic historian Barry Eichengreen wrote an excellent book, Exorbitant Privilege, in 2010, right at the start of my PhD journey. Barry at the time thought it would be just 10 years until we saw a more multipolar currency world where the US dollar was less dominant and perhaps the euro and the renminbi would rise to more significant status. That time frame proved incorrect. We're 15 years on from Barry's book, but perhaps with the dollar, suffering some surprising downward price action here, and despite tariffs, many people thought tariffs would strengthen the dollar. Perhaps we're starting to see Barry's thesis play out finally. And as the world monetary order realigns, perhaps we'll see something like Bitcoin rise to become more important. Larry Fink, the head of BlackRock, was just writing about this a few days ago in his annual letter. It's not inconceivable to imagine a cryptocurrency rising now to be a globally important store of value and medium of exchange. And this kind of like once in a century realignment of world reserve currencies that we tend to see. The last time this happened was about 100 years ago with the rise of the dollar surpassing the British pound. Could be a key driver in the rise of cryptocurrency to become more geopolitically important. I cannot emphasize enough, I think, how important the dynamic between China and the U.S. is in thinking about the geopolitics of cryptocurrency. And I mentioned my blog post back in 2016 where I laid out the case for why I thought the People's Bank of China and China would benefit by embracing Bitcoin. But it's not entirely surprising that we've seen actually the U.S. with the Trump administration announcing its Bitcoin reserve, really taking the lead as a major nation state in embracing cryptocurrency. We've had smaller countries, of course, like El Salvador, which we haven't mentioned, embrace cryptocurrency, even try to push its use for everyday payments by enforcing a requirement that businesses accept Bitcoin and airdropping, Bitcoin into wallets, the Chiva wallet that everyone could access, and so on and so forth. That was a bit of a failed experiment. But the U.S. is the first major country to embrace Bitcoin, and it's really not surprising in some ways, given the open source, decentralized nature of Bitcoin. There's always going to be a challenge, I think, for a more authoritarian regime, more tightly controlled society to embrace Bitcoin in a way that a more open society like the United States can. And in fact, many would argue that a cryptocurrency that is decentralized and can be held in a non-custodial way like Bitcoin can serve as something of a wrecking ball for tightly controlled financial systems and societies. So, it remains to be seen whether or not China figures out a way to kind of coexist with more open financial instruments like Bitcoin. And we'll see if the United States also can coexist, frankly, with an open financial instrument like Bitcoin. Many think that financial repression, another part of my PhD thesis, is likely to return as the U.S.'s debt continues to skyrocket higher. And exit ramps, like crypto, may come under pressure as capital is bottled up to try to make sure there's not a financial crisis in the United States. So, but this dynamic between the U.S. and China is going to be hugely important to understanding kind of what future role Bitcoin plays on a global stage. We could see a scenario where maybe in certain regions, blockchain and Bitcoin are embraced. In other regions, they're blocked. That would seem to be maybe the more likely scenario in the short run, but time will tell. Many economists have been quite critical of the ideas of Friedrich Hayek. Hayek did win a Nobel Prize. Lots of famous debates with Hayek and Keynes, of course. But Hayek's thinking around money in the 1970s, the denationalization money pamphlet that he wrote, really anticipated something like Bitcoin. I'd say where Hayek got the thesis slightly wrong, perhaps, is Hayek thought the most stable currency would win. And time will tell. Hayek may be proven correct, but certainly, in the private money arena, Bitcoin is still the leader, and it's been incredibly volatile. It has not been stable. Stable coins are, of course, growing in importance. But I think many people would prefer to earn something that can go up in value, own something that can go up in value, rather than something that's going to be stable and preserving purchasing power. And that's where a scarce, finite cryptocurrency like Bitcoin has the edge over something like a stable coin. What else could propel the rising use of cryptocurrency as a medium of exchange? Well, the death of cash, certainly, which many economists, Ken Rogoff and others, argue we should hasten, certainly could do that. Something to keep an eye on is what's happening with cash and what's happening with central bank digital currency. In some countries like the US, that seems to be an idea that's been firmly put on the back burner, leaving the future of digital currency to the crypto world, to either currencies like Bitcoin or stablecoins. But what's happening with cash could play an important role in influencing the adoption of anything like Bitcoin as a medium of exchange. And last, I'll just wrap up with, what I've always long thought could hold the best potential driver for greater use of something like Bitcoin as a currency, which is the rise of the machine-to-machine economy. Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are digitally native, they're programmable, they play well with smart contracts, and they don't have a gatekeeper sitting in front of them like, say, credit card networks do, that make it hard to integrate with, say, artificial intelligence systems or other robotic, machine type economic activity. And as you saw a rise in the machine-to-machine economy, one could imagine that just like when you go to Europe and you need to use the coin of the realm, like the euro, when you come to the machine-to-machine economy or need something from that world, you would need to use the coin of that realm, perhaps Bitcoin, perhaps something else that's programmable in nature. And as you saw more and more payments made in that machine-to-machine economy with a cryptocurrency, you could see maybe that transitioning and transferring over to the non-machine world and use of that currency rising there as well. More people wanting their salary in it for convenience reasons, and so on and so forth. So this has been basically a very high-level tour through kind of the world of cryptocurrency and geopolitics. A lot of what this presentation was focused on was thinking about some of the risk factors and some of the drivers for the rise of cryptocurrency from just being an investment and store of value to becoming more of a means of payment, a medium of exchange, because that will have a huge influence on the geopolitical significance of this technology. There's still a lot we don't know about the future geopolitics of crypto, how it could be used to avert sanctions, how it could be used to navigate a world of decreasing globalization. But it's an incredibly exciting time. And I think what's undeniable is that Bitcoin and cryptocurrency are now a discussion point on the geopolitical chessboard. And it's certainly going to be an exciting time for macro watchers like myself to see how this all plays out. Thank you.